Welcome to the eCommerce Profitability Show, a podcast by Link My Books. We speak with profitable e-commerce store owners and experts to help your e-commerce business become profitable. Because revenue is vanity, profit is sanity. I'm your host, Dan Little. Welcome to the e-commerce Profitability Show. Joining us today is John Toon, Tech Strategy Lead and Senior Manager at Beever and Struthers, as well as the owner of J Squared Consultancy, offering advice on accountancy and audit tech. Having spent 20 years of his career in this sphere, he's built up an encyclopedic knowledge of tech around the e-commerce landscape. His expertise on digital transformation provides solutions for companies adapting to new challenges. Let's see how some of his e-commerce insights can help you. John, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks very much for having me on.
Yeah, cool. Right, okay, so jumping straight in, how does your background in accounting shape the way you approach business solutions as opposed to marketing or tech?
I guess given that I am an accountant, everything comes back to numbers more or less all the time. So that's like a key focus for me. And during my career, I've kind of transitioned through various phases. Obviously started out as a trainee and worked at a relatively small practice and now working at quite a large practice with about 250 staff. So given me a broad range of experience of what it's like to work in small organizations and larger organizations, but also to work across expanding businesses and then also working with different types of businesses as we interact with different types of clients along the way. So yeah, there's a real broad range of stuff. And I've now sort of found myself leaning towards doing tech and tech advisory type services. It always comes back to money. Most decisions are based around money. And really what we're trying to do when we do advice for our clients is really help them to improve the way that they operate, which means that they can improve efficiencies typically and improve bottom line.
Yeah. So is that what interests you in sort of the tech space, that you can take a tedious or tricky task and make it easier so that you can then basically deliver more value to the client?
It is, but also I'm an inherently lazy person. So I just get really frustrated with things that don't work particularly well or that take a lot of time. And I think that's probably one of the things that really drove me into the advisory stuff that I do now, is that I quite often go into a business, I just think, geez, like, why are you doing that? Why do you persist with doing these things? And we're humans and we're habit formers, right? And that's one of the issues, is that we just get used to doing something one way and we kind of stick to it because we're familiar with it. And sometimes you just need someone else to come in and give you a bit of a second opinion, maybe tell you that it's wrong, or maybe just give you a bit of a nudge in the right direction. And if we can slot a piece of technology in as well to help that, clearly that makes a big difference as well, because quite often that will streamline a process even more than just changing the way that a process operates.
Yeah. So thinking about the e-commerce space in particular then, what tech excites you in this space? What is something you wish people appreciated or better understood about the tech in that space?
When it comes to e-commerce, in the good old days, it just used to be someone would put something up on their website and they would sell it, and that was fairly straightforward. And the volumes, certainly when I was a bit younger anyway, weren't that big. It wasn't anything you had to worry about too much. Obviously, now we're in a space where you've got multi-channel opportunities across so many different platforms, and volumes, even for a relatively small trader, can be quite large. And so for me, things like what you guys do at Link My Books, the aggregation of that information to pull it into an accounts package, I think is really imperative. And also being able to manage things like VAT or cross-border sales taxes and things like that. Those are probably the trickiest parts of being an e-commerce seller, and operating in one country is probably reasonably easy, shall I say. The great thing about e-com, right, is that you can have a customer anywhere in the world, but that brings with it its own unique challenges around foreign currency, taxation, delivery, the whole plethora of other things, language. And I think technologies that help with that are the ones that make being an e-com seller the easiest. And obviously, again, given that you're all about profit and the show is like, whatever you do with an e-com business, it's got to be as effective and as efficient as possible. And to encourage customers, obviously, to go through that process to close out a basket and buy from you. And that's the most important thing. So you've got to get things in the right place to make sure that you can close a sale, because then obviously you can start making money.
Yeah. So there's sort of the tech side to both of it, isn't there? There's like after the fact, once you've got all this data and you need to be able to get it in your bookkeeping system, then you need to be able to analyze it and make it look pretty. But then there's also actually generating the sale, as you say, and there's so many apps, especially if you're a Shopify seller now, there's like so many apps that you can do to like increase conversions and split test this, that and the other, and maybe you can add something else to your basket once you've already checked out. And there's like lots of ways that you can improve the conversion and the efficiency of the site from both angles. You can look at it after the fact and before the fact. And I think that's quite cool. It must be interesting to have your role and be able to advise on that tech.
It is. It's fascinating. And I mean, given my background, the focus probably is really on that secondary part more often than not, in terms of, how do we make that capture of a sale into the accounting system as easy as possible. And then also how do we make sure that, like I say, that the taxation side of it and everything else is managed effectively. But almost inevitably what happens is that then creeps out into, well, what else can you do for me sort of thing? And that could be anything from trying to implement a CRM, which I'm sure you've probably discussed before, that it can be mega complex and that it can be frustrating, but also into other things like Shopify's got a gazillion plugins and stuff that you can utilize. We're not Shopify experts, but we do work with Shopify experts, and we can call on them to help do everything from create a site from scratch to integrations to improvements and stuff. So yeah, it's great. And ultimately, what we want is a happy business owner, a happy client. We want to see that we've made an impact. That's probably the key thing for us.
Yeah. So based on your experiences in the consultant side of things, then what are the kinds of challenges that companies face when it comes to the digitization or making the best use of it?
I think first and foremost, a lot of businesses don't know what they don't know. I know that sounds quite glib. It applies to a lot of things, but more often than not, we just find that a business will be, I don't know, they'll have picked Xero because their mates are using a Xero, or they've been on a e-com forum or something. It says, use Xero because it's the best, without really having any sort of insights as to why Xero may or may not be the best product for them, in terms of their situation. And then it kind of just sort of stems from there in terms of, I think a lot of businesses they'll pick something like Xero up, and then maybe they'll go on the App Store and they'll see that there's a Shopify connection. So they'll just go for the first one that they find. Again, not necessarily knowing whether or not that helps with, again, aggregating sales information, whether it helps with aggregating taxation information, all those kind of things. Yeah, and as I'm sure you know, Daniel, there's probably about 4 or 5 aggregators that will do that, all in differing ways. So I guess our role in this more often than not is about educating businesses and business owners and sort of saying, right, we could strip right back to the very beginning and sort of say, look, we know you've gone with Xero, but genuinely, is this the right product? Or if you've gone with Xero and you've got a link to your Shopify website, for example, is that working as effectively as it should? Or do we need to wind that back and have another look at something else? And the great thing about a lot of these things is you can test them almost in live. So we can run things side by side with existing products and we can sort of show and demonstrate the difference. So that's always of interest to a business owner because it gives them something that tangibly demonstrates what's good or bad in their business at that point in time.
Yeah. And when we're talking about challenges as well, I think that you raised something before saying that it's relatively simple to sell in one country and then it gets more complex as you expand out. What we find is that a lot of sellers don't even know the countries that they're selling in. They assume that I'm selling products on Amazon.co.uk and therefore I'm selling to UK customers. And what they don't know is that Amazon has a program called the Amazon Global Program, which you're automatically opted into, and their sales are going everywhere. And therefore, Amazon is taking and collecting some of the taxes and keeping that back. And so you don't need to be paying VAT on those sales. And so do you ever find that with clients that they come to you having made those types of errors and that you actually end up saving them money in terms of like reducing their VAT bill because of things like that?
It happens occasionally. I mean, it doesn't happen a lot. But I think that's probably because, as a firm, we're quite broad. We're not an e-com specialist in terms of, we have a team that are specialists, but it's not the only thing that we do as a firm. And so in terms of my wider exposure, because I deal across all of our client types, we don't see it maybe as much as some of the real specialist e-com accountants do. And I know will come to me with horror stories. But yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes Amazon, for example, don't really help themselves in terms of the reporting. It's not always that obvious. It's not very clear. Not always clear where you get it from. And sometimes, frankly, a business owner is not that bothered. They just want to see that, on their dashboard that the sales are completed and the money's going to come in and it's going to arrive in a few days. And so it's probably only sometimes after the fact when they suddenly realize that, I sold something for, £100 and I've only got £85 or something because Amazon deducted whatever. And they're like, well, that's not quite what I wanted and not what I expected. And then you start digging around and you suddenly realize, like you say, that they've been enrolled in one of these programs or something unusual has happened. And then consequences after the fact are always more challenging to deal with because usually with every tax, there's always a deadline and almost inevitably, if you deal with something after the fact, you've probably missed the deadline, which just makes life even more complicated. And it's not helped in the UK by HMRC being so slow to respond to queries and being able to register for VAT if that's appropriate or one-stop shop if that's appropriate and things like that. All of those delays contribute to a wider issue, particularly for e-com, because it's a very fast-moving enterprise in terms of it's immediate, in terms of you've got customers coming at you 24/7, particularly if you are operating international. And so you need to be aware of what you're potentially letting yourself into and try and anticipate some of these things before they do happen, if that's possible.
Yeah. And I think it's not just the tax side of things. Like there is the compliance side where, yes, you need to make sure that you are paying the right amount of taxes, which what we've seen is actually often people pay too much VAT rather than the other way and end up with penalties. But it can be both ways. But I think it's also in terms of profitability, bringing it back to profit here, I think that if you don't know which marketplaces you're actually selling products in, then you can't really determine how much money you're actually making on each sale. Because what we see is a lot of sellers will start out and they will realize that, okay, I can sell this product on Amazon.co.uk and I can make a 25% margin. And then they realize that they have to register for VAT, and that massively reduces it. But then they also miss the point that they're paying VAT on some of these sales that they shouldn't be, where Amazon is only delivering the net amount to them. And therefore, they're actually losing money on those products. And so by turning off that market or by increasing the price for those customers, it's going to drastically affect their bottom line. And without knowing that, because all this data is just all merged together for them and they're just taking, this is how much money was deposited in my bank and therefore that's how much I'm going to declare, they're missing the point entirely. So I think it is really important.
I agree. I think also when you do get enrolled in these like global programs is that the customers on the other side of that typically aren't buying in sterling. If you're a UK seller, they're buying in dollars, euros, whatever it might be. And Amazon and a lot of others also take quite a hefty wedge out of that in terms of their exchange rates and commission fees and stuff. And again, there are cheaper ways to do that, not necessarily through technology, but just through being a little bit more clever and having a foreign currency account with someone that has cheaper exchange rates and stuff and connecting that up. And so that's another way of just saving a little bit of money. And again, with e-com, because it does tend to be high volume stuff, this can get away from you really quickly if you're not aware of it, and it can cost you a considerable amount of money. I mean, I've dealt with a business that was an e-com space that we could manage to save 20 grand a year just by changing their bank account in terms of how they receive euros, I think it was. And you wouldn't think you could have that kind of impact. And this was a business that was only turning over a few $100,000. So it's not like it was a $1 million business with a relatively small saving. This was quite a considerable saving that we could make off a relatively small turnover.
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. That's actually something that we do as well. When people connect up to Link My Books, we actually detect if they're getting any payouts in foreign currencies. And then we have a partnership with one of those banks called R.E.P.R.E.S.E.N.T. So Amazon, for example, charge 1.5%. We then basically show them in black and white on the screen and say, in the last 90 days, you've basically wasted this much money by letting Amazon convert this. You would have saved that if you just moved to R.E.P.R.E.S.E.N.T. And it is literally just open a bank account in euros, get the money in euros, convert it into pounds at a better rate, transfer it on your normal bank account. So it's not a complicated thing, but it's just, as you say, people need to know about that. And so it comes back to this thing about that you can do things with tech to improve the conversion and like improve the marketing. And then you can do things with tech after the fact. And I think that people tend to like spending most time in the first bit because they think it's cool to like, oh, let's try out these new tools that can help with conversion and drive sales. But little do they know that they can actually improve profits by doing stuff after the fact as well. So I think that's where people like you come in to advise. So that's cool.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah. So how do the differences between big and small businesses become salient when it comes to providing solutions for e-commerce?
I guess it depends on what you mean by big and small, right? Because again, e-commerce in particular is one of these weird type of businesses where you can be selling widgets, 50p each, but you can sell millions of them. Or you can sell a £1 million widget and you can sell 2 of them every year or something. And both of those could be big businesses. But if you're only selling 2 things a year, does that make you a big business, even if it's high value? I don't know, is my genuine answer. So for me, whenever we deal with e-commerce businesses, the key thing that we're always interested in more often than not is volume. Because again, if I kind of wind this back to the accounting side of things, if you are sitting in a Xero or a QuickBooks or something like that, they do have volume transaction limits and restrictions within those systems, which then if you kind of start to bust through those limits, then it makes it difficult for you to run things like a VAT return, for example. You don't want to be in the position where you can't run a VAT return because that causes you issues in terms of being able to comply with the law. So for us, it's all about volume. And what we're interested in is if you are a high volume trader, how do we manage that trade in terms of what kind of information do we push into your accounting system if it is a Xero QuickBooks, or even is that kind of product still appropriate to you? And maybe should you trade up to something a little bit larger like an ERP type system, which will allow you to do different types of reporting, but also generally allow you to just manage large amounts of volume. The challenge when you start to move into the larger ERP spaces is that typically the technologies that are available to those products, not always, but quite significantly, the technologies that are available to those type of products are nowhere near as sophisticated or as good quality as the ones that are in the Xero and QuickBooks marketplace. And so there is sometimes a bit of a challenge around, as a smaller, or however we define that, as a smaller e-commerce business maybe trades out of being an Intuit QuickBooks, a Xero kind of based product, moving into an ERP type one, is like, how do we manage that transition between systems? Because it is likely that we'll be taking some of the technologies that they're familiar with out and replacing them with other technologies to still do some of the same things that they were familiar with, but in a different way because of either the way the integrations work or because maybe that ERP has a direct baked-in integration with Amazon, let's say, for example. And quite often that changes the way you operate. It's not just an accounting issue in terms of your accounts product looks a little bit different, but it can be sometimes that your operational systems and processes need to change or need to be adapted just to accommodate these things. So it doesn't always affect the accountants of the business, but it might affect some of the ops people in the business, depending on your scale, obviously.
Speaking from sort of the developer's side of things, I sort of know the systems that you're talking about. And the types of businesses that typically use those tend to be so large that they develop their own integrations, they develop their own way of bringing stuff into their customized ERP. And so I think that's potentially why there's not as many app developer apps available to those types of programs. And I think that the other thing is that Xero and QuickBooks obviously have their app stores. And so for us, again, as app developers, it makes it a good marketing channel for us. It's a good way for us to be able to build up reviews on those platforms. And then, as you say, these businesses typically sign up to Xero because one of their friends has told them to do it. And then they go to the App Store and they type in Amazon or they type in Shopify, and there we are in the list. So hopefully they try us and hopefully they like us, and that's just how it goes. But I think that's potentially not quite the same with your NetSuites of the world and the sort of other ERP systems out there.
Yeah, I think it is changing in that space. You mentioned NetSuite, and we know, for example, that probably over the last couple of years, maybe a little bit longer now, they have been sort of starting to open up the product to third-party developers. They have been starting to look at how they kind of build out an ecosystem of apps that plug in. Because again, one of the things I always say about an ERP is that they are mega complex products. But the thing is because typically they've all been built and developed by that one developer, or they've been acquired by that one developer and sort of pushed into one singular product. You tend to make a compromise in terms of it allows scalability, but it's not kind of like the best set of products if you were to bring them all together. Again, that's where the compromise is that a business scaling out of, say, a Xero with the ecosystem, which is typically a whole bunch of really good products finely tuned into what they're trying to deliver as a service. And then moving into an ERP, which is a little bit more broad brush, and so you're compromising in terms of capability, quality, etc. But they are getting cute to that, and they are aware that businesses might be using Link My Books, for example, and might want to scale that out into a NetSuite or maybe into an R.E.P.R.E.S.E.N.T or something like that in terms of moving up a notch from an accounting capability point of view.
Yeah. And then we'll have to see what AI brings as well, if anything like that brings about, which brings me nicely to my next question, actually. So I'm hearing that about 5 years ago, you showed a little bit of skepticism around AI and its use as a buzzword to brand anything new. Has anything changed in that time?
I did have some skepticism. I mean, this is mainly sort of focused at vendors like yourselves, although I'm not entirely sure if Link My Books were guilty of this, but AI was a buzzword at one point where it seemed that every accounting software vendor in the world was telling us about how they were using AI in their products. And then when you kind of like looked under the hood, it was a little bit different from the reality. So yeah, I was a skeptic. I mean, I've been talking about AI for quite a long time in my various roles and stuff. And I think one of the things to be aware of is like for any accountant and any business that's using any cloud technology, they're probably using AI already without really realizing it. I mean, we certainly use it in our personal lives, right? If you've got one of these, like a mobile phone, every time you take a selfie or post on LinkedIn or whatever, that's using AI to help support that process. But you just don't think about it because it's just natural. It's part of the process. And we've got businesses using things like OCR technology, so the technology to extract information from invoices. That's a form of AI. We've got technology that helps us to forecast out things. And you'll see that when you're on things like Amazon and Shopify, you can kind of help it to predict what your sales might look like. That's just using machine learning. That's part of AI. Obviously, the AI conversation's changed massively since the launch of ChatGPT and got all this conversation about large language models and how they may change things. I do think those are going to have quite a fundamental effect on a lot of businesses, and in particular like e-com, right? Because with an e-com business, if you've got your own website or even if it's hosted on Shopify, things like the ability to have a chatbot to interact with a customer, to anticipate maybe what they're buying and things, A large language model takes a fairly dumb chatbot where you get to a point where it sort of says computer says no because the customer asks a question that it doesn't have an answer for. A large language model allows that to be contextualized and keep that conversation rolling. So it's likely that your conversion rate might tick up if you're using a ChatGPT powered chatbot, for example, on your website. And I've seen a few examples of those, which are pretty clever. Apple fairly recently launched a demo of a sales conversation, not quite an e-commerce type thing, but you were trying to sell their new vision goggles to someone, and the chatbot on the other end of the telephone conversation was completely AI powered and talking to them. That was quite fascinating.
Like actual voice?
Yeah. It was a voice call. It was all AI and went through and completed a sale with a genuine customer. So that's like quite impressive.
Wow, that is quite powerful. We use Intercom as our CRM, and they have a thing called Fin, which is their new like AI powered bot. We've tried that and it's both good and bad. Like it can hook into your help desk, so it reads all your help articles and then it uses that to then regurgitate that information. And I think partly potentially it's our fault because we have some older help docs that could maybe do with being like updated or replaced with some newer ones. And then we have some where like we have a new version and we've got an old version. So I think it gets a little bit confused. But we tested it for a couple of weeks and it didn't get amazing feedback from customers. But I think that type of thing in an e-commerce setting, like I think our product is maybe a bit more complicated, but in an e-commerce setting where someone's looking at some trousers and they're asking about sizing, then 100%, yeah, that can fill the gap. And like you say, it's not like a computer says, no, let me get you connected to an agent that's going to be 2 weeks to reply to you. It's like, I can help you immediately because I've been given the right information.
And I think you touched that point there, Daniel, which is your data's got to be really good to use AI, particularly large language models, because we've heard all this stuff about the hallucinations of things like ChatGPT and Google Bard and stuff. And these hallucinations are just basically because what these large language models do is they just extrapolate from the information available to them what the likely answer should be. Now, in your example, if you've got an old document that's been replaced by a new one, but it can look at both, and it's going to look at both and go, right, well, they've given this help desk document and I'm going to just extrapolate from both of these what the likely answer is. And unless you kind of make it really clear what the answer should be, then clearly it's either going to fall somewhere in between or it might give you a 50-50 response in terms of one way or the other. That's one of the issues. So as a business, we're looking at AI, particularly around large language models, how it might help us. But again, part of our preparation for that is actually to go through all of our data to clean it, making sure we're moving as much of it into the cloud and to make sure that we've only got single versions of copies of documents that are relevant for what we want to do. But also just make sure that our data is much more consistent and it's concise, so it's not too confusing to analyze and understand. So it's a big project for any business. But I think for any business that's particularly interested in the use of AI, I think 2024 is going to be a big one. I would say businesses, e-commerce businesses in particular, should like really just focus in on one area that they think would be good to experiment with, not just sort of try and do it broad brush. So maybe it would be that kind of like sophisticated chatbot on the website. Maybe it'd be something baked into your CRM if you use one, or maybe it would just be maybe looking at how you could build your own chatbot based on some information that you have to be able to publish somewhere, whether it's in an app or something else.
Yeah. So what else do you think is coming then? So looking ahead, what emerging trends and technologies do you think will have the most significant impact around the next few years?
We've got a few things that are going to be happening over the next few years. I mean, we know we've got digital invoicing coming into the EU. I mean, that's probably not going to affect e-com sellers as much because that's mainly going to affect B2B. But even on e-com, right, even if you think you're selling B2C, you will have businesses still coming to your website or coming to your Shopify store or your Amazon store or whatever. So it is quite complicated. We're going to have some interesting stuff around that. I think we're going to have some general tightening around taxation rules and trading rules and stuff. The e-invoicing stuff I mentioned is kind of like an indicator of where that's going to go across the European Union in terms of, they're wanting to try and make things like cross-border sales a little bit more accountable, but also just to make it easier for them to manage collecting of information and data. I think also it was just earlier this year, wasn't it? We've had some of the new changes around websites like R.E.P.R.E.S.E.N.T and others having to provide information to HMRC so that, again, you're missing stuff. So I think a lot of the changes that are going to happen over the next few years are probably going to be around things like taxation compliance. And there's absolutely no reason why that shouldn't happen because we're increasingly digitizing everything. E-commerce is typically one of the most digitized areas of business by dint of the fact that you've got to be doing it on a website, on a platform. And so that is probably the big thing. I think for most e-com businesses, though, that shouldn't have an impact. in terms of if you've got everything set up right and everything else, you shouldn't have any concerns about it. And in fact, what it might do is it might save you a bit of time and effort. Because could you imagine if you get to doing your one-stop shop VAT returns, for example, it's already got all the information there for you and it can verify and go, yeah, it looks great. Your accounts matches the information we've received. That kind of stuff would be great because it just means that you minimize the risk of mistakes. And equally, if there was something slightly awry, then maybe that could be flagged before you kind of press the big red button. And I think in terms of other technologies coming into the space, I think the main one is going to be AI, frankly. I mean, I know that's a bit of a cop-out in terms of what else is maybe coming, but that is still a big area of focus for a lot of businesses. And I was involved in a survey that HLB International, which is the network our firm's part of, did late last year. And they talked to all types of different businesses, but they're predominantly focused on AI. They kind of talk about things like crypto is pretty much gone. There is some talk about cloud technologies and better integration. So maybe that's something to look out for as well. But again, I think e-com businesses are quite well served in that space. I think the big issue is for them to latch on to those kind of technologies and make sure they implement them because, as I said earlier on, you don't know what you don't know. So if you're still trying to run an e-com business on a desktop accounting product, for example, you're completely bonkers and you need to change like immediately. But equally, if you're looking to scale that business out or maybe try and operate in a different country, you've got to think about how you do that. And it's not just about the accounting technology and that side, but we talked about banking and stuff. That kind of stuff is really important too.
And I think it is important to think about scale early on as well. I built up and sold 2 Amazon businesses before I started Link My Books. And the first one taught me a lot of lessons around how accounting needs to be there in order for the buyers to be interested in your business. So I think a lot of these sellers are starting up who are thinking that eventually they will have a sale. One day they'll exit this business and they'll be able to sit on a beach and earn millions of pounds and all that. But in order to get there, you have to early on start thinking about scale. Think about how can I make it so that this is an attractive business to a buyer? How can I build as many automations in processes? How can I get all my SOPs documented so that someone can just take this business and just run with it and that I don't need to be in it all the time? But I also think that coming back to your point around the changes in taxations coming, if we roll back the clock to when Making Tax Digital was coming out, and also they made a load of changes around e-commerce VAT, specifically that if the goods were located outside the UK, that the marketplaces were now responsible for collecting the VAT. I think that everyone was a bit worried about that in the beginning because it's like a new thing. Oh, how am I going to sort all this out? It's a total logistical nightmare. But if anything, it actually leveled the playing field because the people that were abusing that were the Chinese sellers who were just not registering for VAT, who were able to undercut you on price because you, as a legitimate UK business, were registered for VAT, and therefore they were making 20% more profit without having to even lift a finger. And so they could just undercut you. So I think that as more clamping down around taxation comes and making things easier to be able to pay the right amount of tax and to work all that out, I think that'll only be a good thing for, as I say, leveling the playing field and making it so that everyone is battling with the same tools.
I completely agree. And I mean, I know, ironically, this wasn't in preparation for this specifically, but I saw something yesterday where there's actually some avoidance work going on now as a consequence of those rule changes because some of those foreign traders have opened up effectively entities in the UK to try and bypass those rules. And yeah, I mean, it'll take a bit of time for that kind of to wash through and things and bits and pieces, but I think that'd be really important. I think one of the things I would like to see, actually going back to the sort of technology angle, is that we know that there can be risks when you're a consumer of stuff in the e-commerce space in terms of how do you know that what you're buying is genuine and legitimate? How do you know that it complies with local safety laws, etc.? So you see every so often in the news, you can buy medicines that shouldn't be available online, or you buy toys that are unsafe and don't comply with kite mark and things like that. That for me would be a really interesting area where I think technology could make a big difference in terms of being able to sort of pre-verify sellers on platforms, pre-verify products on the platforms that they are genuine. Because I guess the only way to get around that at the moment is to rely on reviews. And we know, again, that sometimes reviews can be gamed or they can be non-genuine. And so there's a challenge there. So I think from a consumer angle, that'd be an interesting place to be. And I know that might add complexity to an e-commerce business in terms of trying to comply with that. But again, complying with these kind of things, again, like you say, there's levels of playing field. So it means that you're not playing an uneven game where somebody can undercut you just because they're selling a crap product, basically, which is not equivalent to a good quality product that should attract a premium, and you shouldn't have your margins eroded as a consequence of that kind of competition.
Yeah. I know one of my friends is like a tech person in the pharmaceutical industry, and they are changing their packaging around having like scannable, individualized QR codes on the packaging so that you can scan and verify that it's a genuine piece of medical equipment it is, or drugs or whatever, just to make sure that it is valid. So I think it's the same sort of concept, isn't it? And I agree that it definitely, again, comes back to leveling the playing field. I know when I was running my Amazon business that I think a lot of sellers worry too much about like barriers to entry, and it's hard to get into these different niches, like hard to get into gated categories and sell toys and things like that. I actually saw it the other way around. It's like the more barriers to entry there is, the less competition there's going to be, the less people you're going to be battling against selling the same type of products. So it needs to be sort of like clamped down to allow competition, but to make sure that everyone is competing fairly, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I could agree with that. And I mean, I typically think about e-commerce being one of those areas of business where actually the barriers to entry is so low. I mean, yes, there are some particular parts of that, like you say, where you have to comply with regulations. But a lot of things, there's very little regulation, if you like, around selling a lot of things. And so, yeah, the barriers are low, but that means that you've just got to get all the other bits and pieces in place correctly. So, get the structure of your organization right, get the structure of your operations right. Even when you're just starting out as a single person, maybe doing everything from finding the items, selling the items, boxing them up, obviously, well, maybe if you get involved in everything. And then, like you say, try and figure out how you make that scalable, because we found with some of our e-com businesses is that they can sort of trundle along at quite low volumes, and all of a sudden something becomes massively fashionable and they just hit this huge spike, and they go off the charts, and they can find that really challenging to sort of deal with that demand management and demand prediction as well, which is another one. But I think it's really important that you get the structures right. And again, e-com should be an area of business where you should make money pretty much from the get-go, like you were saying, in terms of, we're talking about profitability, then even at the most basic fundamental level, you should know that every time you sell a product, you're selling it for a profit. You should know that every time you look to scale, that you can scale that profitably so that you can work out that there is an exit at some point in the future. Exits are always based on a multiple of profitability, however you determine that. So it's got to be there. And it's quite difficult with an e-com business to go from not being very profitable to being very profitable, unless you're very lucky and either can increase your margin or you can increase your scale without bringing in more people or more costs into the business. And that can be quite challenging to do that. So get the structure right and everything from the get-go, and you've got a good opportunity to sort of scale out. And if you want that sale exit, then perfect, you can get that.
No, I absolutely agree. I was speaking to Aaron Cordovez, who is one of Amazon's top 100 sellers last week. He was on the show and he said something which resonated quite well. He said, if you learn e-commerce now, in 10 years, there's no way you won't be a millionaire. And I was like, that's such a powerful statement, because a lot of it is true. Like, if you do learn e-commerce and the way it's going now, the trend is that everything is moving that way. If you can get good at it and you can become someone who can capitalize on that, then yeah, there's no reason you can't be a millionaire, because these businesses sell when they get to that size. So yeah, thought that was quite a cool statement.
Absolutely.
So that's all the nitty gritty questions out the way. We've got a couple of closing ones here. So who would you most like to take out for coffee from either the e-commerce world or someone within maybe the accountancy space that you would like to pick their brains?
Oh my word. I'm going to go big and just say Jeff Bezos. I mean, here's a guy that started trading from his garage, selling books on the cusp of when, the internet launched and everything else. And now one of the most richest, most successful guys, having turned that into this global monster thing that everyone uses pretty much every single day. And yeah, I'd be really interested in just knowing more about his story. And I know there's lots of books and films and whatever, but actually hearing it from him firsthand would be fascinating, because I'm sure along the way in that story, there's a little bit of luck, but I'm sure there's plenty of determination, plenty of strategy, plenty of planning and things, and also quite a few failures as well. So I think that'd be fascinating to hear. And we all have ambitions of being successful, but I'm never quite sure if anyone has ambitions of being that kind of level of successful, because that's like stratospheric, really.
Yeah, I totally agree. I sometimes think that as well. I wonder if these people wake up in like their 20s and just think, I really want to be right up there. How do I get there? So what would be your burning question for him then? If you got 10 minutes for them and you could ask him 1 or 2 questions, what would it be?
I think for me, my key question would be, what was the catalyst and what made him sort of stick with the internet, as it were, in those early days? Because again, talking about technology, it was difficult. There are lots of naysayers sort of saying, oh, no, this isn't going to last kind of thing. And he was just literally shipping stuff out of his garage, and he could have carried on doing that. That would be the thing, was like, why did he sort of double down on that? What was it that made him do it? Did he see some data? Was there some metrics? Was there sales? Was there something in there that showed him that he could make a bit more money through that and he just took a chance? Or was it a bit more planned out? I think that would be a key one. I think the other one would be, I'm interested in the competitive landscape now. Obviously, in places like China, for example, Amazon doesn't have a footprint and they've got Alibaba, effectively copying what they've done. And I'd be really interested in hearing what he thinks about that in terms of, does he feel like that's an opportunity missed, or is that a frustration of his, or is that just the way it is? Just have to deal with it.
Yeah. No, interesting. It's funny because you're the third person who said that they would be top of the list to speak to Jeff Bezos. So I think he's obviously a very influential guy. But yeah, I wonder if we're ever going to get that opportunity again that he got, where he took a business and it was just at the cusp of when the internet was coming out and the technology changed so drastically that Amazon grew on the back of that. Do you think that AI could potentially be the new internet, or is it just another buzz?
I think it could be. It's sort of trying to predict something which is almost like unpredictable. But yeah, I do think it could be. I mean, again, going back to ChatGPT, for example, we're just starting to see they're allowing specific industry or sort of sector or knowledge-specific type bots to be launched into ChatGPT. I'm not sure that's going to be massively disruptive maybe to the e-commerce space, but in my world, as an accountant, you could suddenly see that, I don't know, KPMG launch a tax bot, and then it's like, well, I'll just go to that every time. I don't need to bother going to our firm or something. So I do think there's going to be some kind of disruption around that. I think AI does offer the opportunity for a business to scale rapidly and actually reduce costs and be really effective at stuff. I mean, again, going back to the Amazon examples, they're using really clever AI to help them with more effective picking of products from their warehouses. And they do it in such a way, they don't have all of their products in one place on a set of shelves. They have them distributed around a warehouse because they know that if you have them all in one place, you create congestion when a product's really popular. So to sort of spread it around a bit more means that, if you've got 150 people picking items or machines picking items, that you're not going to get this congestion in one place in a warehouse because everyone's trying to get the same thing off the shelf at the same time. That kind of stuff is pretty obvious when you point it out. But I think prior to it being pointed out and someone sort of saying that's what you need to think about, that's not obvious. That's the thing about technology sometimes, is that it solves the obvious problem that no one actually realizes was there.
Yeah, I've read the same article actually, and they also did some research on the average distance that people have to walk. So if the products are all stored in one location and then all the other products are stored, so like product A is in one end of the warehouse and product B is in the other end of the warehouse, if instead you just have product A and B scattered throughout the warehouse, then it can be a more efficient way for you to pick A and B and come back to the same place you were. So it's really quite magical to think about all the things that go on underneath the surface when you click a button to order something on Amazon and then less than 12 hours later it's at your door. So it's quite cool.
It's got to be so well structured as well, because I've been to warehouses where a warehouse manager doesn't actually know where things are at. You couldn't manage that in an Amazon space because you've got to know exactly that there's 3 things of this product here, there's another 3 products of that there, and to know exactly where that is and have it completely mapped out. Without that, you can't even manage to kind of get to that level of sophistication. And that's, again, it comes back to control systems, data, all of those kind of things have to be really nailed down to enable you to then take technology on to make that process more efficient.
Yeah. Well, I could see that we could talk about this until the cows come home, but I think we've hit time now. So last question for you is, how do people get in touch with you if they're interested in some consultancy or potentially moving across to your firm and getting some tech advice from an e-commerce standpoint?
You can find me on LinkedIn, pretty much on there every day, either doom scrolling or occasionally posting some nonsense, so that's all good. And equally, you can find the firm's website. It's www.beeverstruthers.co.uk. Find me on there. You'll be able to email me, etc., get in contact. And like I say, LinkedIn's probably the best and most direct place to get a hold of me. We're always interested in talking to interesting businesses and talking to interesting vendors as well, because there's some great opportunities for us to do good work with people.
Nice. Cool. Well, thank you very much for your time today, John. It was a nice experience talking to you. I think we've got a lot of golden nuggets here that the audience will really enjoy. So we'll see you next time.
Cheers, Daniel. Thank you.
The e-commerce profitability show is brought to you by Link My Books. To find out more about Link My Books and how to accurately automate your e-commerce bookkeeping to ensure profitable growth, visit linkmybooks.com and then make sure to search for e-commerce profitability in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Link My Books, thanks for listening.